Right, so a story that has actually got some reasonable press attention right now, but actually has some severe potential ramifications for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, is the news about Bristol University Sociology academic professor David Miller winning his employment tribunal case against his employers for wrongful dismissal on the basis that his anti-Zionist views are a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act, that they amount to a philosophical choice, and by doing so means that no longer can people be discriminated against for being pro-Palestinians, can no longer be discriminated against for being against Zionist beliefs. No longer can anti-Zionism be equated with antisemitism, with any weight being lent to that argument. It is a falsehood demonstrated in law now. So I wonder how many people have been purged from the Labour Party, particularly under what passes for the leadership of Keir Starmer, a self-proclaimed Zionist without qualification. And indeed, what does that self-titled statement now say about him and the sort of Prime Minister he'd make, should he get elected? Right, so first and foremost, a massive congratulations to Professor David Miller for his employment tribunal win. If ever there was a guy in a position to take on this media spin regarding Zionism, though, operating firmly on the side of the Zionist lobby, the Israel lobby, justifying attacks on people, calling out Israel for decades of oppression, protecting those in power with similar views instead of holding them to account. Well before the events of October 7th marked a substantial shift in how people think as the events in Gaza recorded via social media for all to see shocked the world. Then it was him. You see, David Miller is an academic sociologist. His specialty is in state and corporate propaganda. So his unfair dismissal in 2021 for having anti-Zionist beliefs, brought to bear on him by his employer as a result of intense lobbying by Zionists, meant he was quite confident despite the high profile of the case, and so he was proven correct to be so, as the 108-page judgment established unfair dismissal due to his philosophical beliefs that Zionism is itself inherently racist, imperialist and colonial, and that he had been discriminated against on that basis on all counts. You don't get a more emphatic victory than that. In one interview with Press TV, Miller said, "So first of all, I was wrongfully dismissed by the university. They didn't properly investigate the complaints against me. They didn't properly evaluate what they should do with the results of their investigation. Second of all, the court determined that my anti-Zionist views are protected under law and that it is illegal to discriminate against someone who has anti-Zionist views. And they determined that the university had, contrary to what they had said, actually dismissed me because of my anti-Zionist views. So that was the key finding. And of course that's a protection going forward for every person in the UK in employment who is attacked by their employer or by the Zionist movement, that they cannot be sacked for those views." Now that last part is very important because so many people in this country have had their anti-Zionist views challenged aggressively, used against them, to the point some have had people ring their employers and accuse them of being racist as a consequence. It is now defined in equalities law that being anti-Zionist is not racist. It is in fact protected under law. Would you put it past the Tories or Starmer's Labour to address that point and legislate it to be otherwise, though, at some point in the future? They'd struggle to, I think, given the fallout we're having right here and right now on this issue, but they would try. These are the sort of politicians who legislated Rwanda to be a safe country when it isn't, after all. It would be a bad law if it came about, a rotten law, utterly against the meaning of equalities, but that's a potential challenge for the future. In the here and now, it's potentially very bad news for organisations that have been, let's say, using and abusing anti-Zionism and potentially equating it with anti-Semitism, which brings me on to Keir Starmer's Labour Party. The purges of ordinary members, suspensions of elected officials at all levels. One example of whom is the former Labour MP Chris Williamson, hounded out of the Labour Party for being opposed to Zionism, being targeted as an anti-Semite by pro-Zionists. And his comment on this victory by Professor Miller stood out for me because he said, "This is a landmark case and will cause huge ramifications, I think, for other people who have been targeted by the Zionist lobby, and many people have been threatened with their employment. Others have lost employment as a result of their support for the Palestinian people. So now we've got established in law that opposition to Zionism is a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act." How many people in the Labour Party have been purged or think they might have been purged, suspended, expelled? How many former affiliate groups were proscribed for anti-Semitism as a result of being targeted for anti-Zionism instead, or for holding anti-Zionist views, rather than it having been demonstrated that they had done or said something that was actually anti-Semitic. Seems to me they'd have a case under the Equalities Act against Labour then, wouldn't they? Of course, to make a complaint under the Equalities Act for having anti-Zionist views against an employer, or potentially the Labour Party as a former member, you now know your right to hold anti-Zionist views as a protected characteristic. But there's a statute of limitations involved in that you are supposed to make your complaint within 6 months less a day, or in the case of an employer 3 months less a day, if you feel you've been discriminated against under the Equalities Act. However, because anti-Zionism has only now been defined as a protected characteristic in law, just now, and people have been dismissed from work or expelled from Labour, as an example, for years now, that might not necessarily apply. It becomes a question of the courts accepting a much later claim on the grounds that they find it just and equitable to do so, and it is within their power to exercise their discretion here. Clearly, the reasons why it would be just and equitable to do so are obvious. Anti-Zionism has only now become a protected characteristic recognised in law. So for as far as employment goes, like David Miller, there is the employment tribunal route. If you're unionised, then there is your trade union to turn to for advice. But if you're a former Labour Party member and you want to know whether you have a case, well, luckily some advice from lawyer Tasnimeh Akunji has been provided, because he said, if you were expelled from the Labour Party due to anti-Semitism, but you feel the evidence used against you to expel you was actually anti-Zionist in nature and not anti-Semitic, do the following. 1. Send a subject access request to the Labour Party requesting all docs they hold on you containing your name. 2. If they don't respond, go to a solicitor and they will go to court and sue them for you. 3. When you receive the material requested under the SAR, go to a solicitor and have them assess whether you have a claim against the party for discrimination under the Equality Act 2010, Human Rights Act 98. Now, I don't want to preempt matters, but a group action was being mounted against the Labour Party by members who felt they had been unfairly excluded. This new finding might well strengthen their claims, or prompt a whole new action to be put together altogether. Either way, with the sheer amount of people who have been purged with the pro-Zionist mentality of the Labour Party at all levels, especially at the highest level, I find it very hard to believe the party won't be in a lot of bother over this potentially. I can quite conceivably see Starmer legislate against this if he gets into power before these cases get made against his party, though. So if you're thinking about it, perhaps don't hang around. Not that he's got a leg to stand on regarding equalities anyway, as he's just tried launching equalities policy just in the last few days. I don't know if you heard about this, but he kept people of colour out, black rights groups out, the press out, and of course continues to ignore the racism pointed out in the Ford report. So equalities is a bit of a running joke under him. Labour under Starmer has an appalling record on racism, unless it is anti-Semitism, and even that now has been severely weakened, potentially with legal action set to prove how it was weaponised rather than actually fought as well. With this new finding, Labour's insultingly bad handling of racism matters is coming to a boiling head now, not least amongst Muslim voters, half of whom who once supported Labour may now have already deserted them. Once again, it is the Zionist views of Starmer and co that have done that, as they remain staunchly pro-Israel in the face of the Gazan genocide. But going back before then as well, over the last few years, as this video here will explain all about, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.